Territories, which had 23 Cuban artists in it, and as I say, it took place in 7 galleries throughout the city, and we had, I think, 13 artists come to Vancouver, so it was quite an event. And it really started the relationship with Cuban artists. Following that, Tonel had an exhibition here at the Belkin in 2002. In 2006, we did an exhibition called Certain Encounters from the Darrow's Latin America collection, which covered a lot of Latin American countries, but also included Cuban artists. And also Tonel was in the original Utopian Territories exhibition, as was Manuel Pina, who is here somewhere, but I'm not quite sure, who also lives in Vancouver now, and both of them teach at UBC. And then we've also, the gallery has been collecting Cuban art on a fairly modest basis, but there has been a continuity with doing that. And part of that is very often galleries and museums do exhibitions of, you know, new art from this country or new art from that country, and they do it once and it's done. But the Belkin really felt that they wanted to kind of keep up a relationship. So the last big exhibition was in 1997, so now we're 15 years later, and this is a kind of an update in a sense. And it really evolved with Tonel and I having a conversation about doing an exhibition, which originally started about the relationship between Cuba and China, maybe bringing art from Cuba and China from the 70s and 80s together, but we were just kind of unsure about that. So it developed more into looking at contemporary art taking place now. Do you have anything that you want to add?
No, good afternoon. I think that's a great introduction. Just wanted to say that yes, this is in a sense something that takes where the 1997 Utopian Territories show left, but at the same time the focus now has narrowed. We want to make clear from the title and the concept that it's really about Havana right now, as opposed to a show that we pretend to be about representing Cuban art. So we have focused more on this city and what's happening and has been happening in the last 20 years or so, and how that's reflected in the art.
Yeah, and for me, I had gone to Cuba a number of times through the 90s up until 2003, and then I had a bit of a break because my work and focus had changed to Asia. And so I went back after talking to Tonel and us thinking about doing an exhibition. I went back in 2012, so there was a break of 9 years, and I really noticed a remarkable shift in the artwork that was produced there. And after the talk, you might want to go to the front desk because we have the Utopian Territories catalog, and you can look through the images there and really see, maybe see the difference of the kind of work that was being produced at that time, which was more about painting, sculpture, installation, printmaking, photography. There was no video. We had no video in that exhibition. In this exhibition, there is quite a bit of a video. When I went, we did independent research at first. I went on my own to Cuba with a long list of artists to visit. And I didn't really go with an agenda because I wasn't really kind of up to date about what was going on. So really I just kind of like soaked in information, and there were things that just kept hitting me about the artwork that was being produced. A lot of it sort of very much engaged with social issues, which it was in '97, but in very different ways. And there was very much a direct engagement with social issues. And there were these creative streams that kept coming up. So as Tonel said, this exhibition isn't a survey of Cuban art, but really some of the creative streams that kind of stood out for us in terms of what artists were doing. And some of those streams had to do with issues of the economy, with issues of language, and communication through language and the instability of language, issues of money and value, also issues of food and nature, which are they're all things that kind of I didn't expect to come across, but it was like this surprising things that artists were dealing with this. So you'll see this throughout the exhibition. In terms of the installation of the exhibition, we had a number of conversations of how to present this work. We could put it in little, this is the food and nature category, and this is the language category, and this is the money and economy category, but we decided to kind of mix it up a bit so that the exhibition really becomes works talking to each other throughout the whole exhibition, as opposed to works kind of sitting on their own, and you go to one work and look at it and think, I like it, I don't like it, then you go to the other one, I like it or don't like it. It's more that we wanted the exhibition to work as a whole. And we also have these, what we call kind of ambient pieces, this being one of them by Juan Carlos Alom, called Havana Solo. And it's really a very kind of impressionistic film about Havana. It doesn't have a beginning or an end, there's no narrative to it, but it's kind of there, and it's always there as you go through the exhibition, and there are other pieces that are kind of there through the exhibition, but they don't have this kind of narrative, and they're not like a hermetic piece in any way. Anything?
Yeah. Just one more thing in terms of those threads that are, you can follow through the whole show. I think one of them is also the physicality of people and the city, and how those bodies interact, the urban and architectural environment where people live, houses, buildings, the city, but also how the bodies of the people are being transformed, informed by that environment, and how people interact with that environment.
So maybe we can just kind of start talking about the work, and we kind of saw this, doing an installation is a really difficult thing to do, especially in a gallery like this, because you can't really predict people's movements through. Some people may go down the hallway first, some people may come in here, exit through there to the next room, or go around here and exit through there. So in installing an exhibition, you're kind of thinking about like how works are going to be received, and how what you've seen is going to inform what you're going to see. So there's a play between a kind of creating a dialogue or a language, but also something that looks good. And we wanted aesthetically for the exhibition to look good. So those are the kinds of things that really sort of informed where we put things. And we had ideas about where things should go, but of course they shift and move around. This room kind of encapsulates a lot of the streams that we are talking about in terms of value and economy. There's the drawings over there of stacks of pesos, which are kind of also have this desirous quality to them, because they're things that people want, and money. Here we have Ricardo Elias, his photographs of abandoned sugar mills, and sugar was like a main force within the economy for many, many decades, but after the Russian Soviet Union's abandoned Cuba financially, and they were a main market for sugar, the sugar industry fell, and I think it makes up like 5% of their economy at this point. So this is really about like speaking to the economy, but speaking to a kind of ruinous economy. This piece here, and actually these pieces in the corner deal very much with this idea of language. And this is Tom Wong's work. And there are these text bubbles, which have actually no text in them. So, I mean, the idea of the exhibition and the title, The Spaces Between, I mean, one thing that I really noticed when looking at the artwork is that the work was presented, very often it didn't have a clear narrative, and there seemed to be a political component to it, but nothing was overt. And it was sort of up to me to construct that politic and fill in the blanks, in a sense. So there's this kind of space between the work and the reception of the work from the viewer. The other idea, the space between, arise from a past that has occurred and a future that's unknown. And I think that's very much a tenor of Cuba today is that they're in this in-between position where something is going to happen. Fidel Castro is no longer, in power as such. His brother is in power, and I think there was an expectation that there would be changes, and there have been changes. They've been subtle and slow, but it's like this waiting, this kind of constant waiting for what it's going to be, and nobody really knows. So that is also feeding into the spaces in between. And also, again, with these kinds of things between language and its truth. And this piece over here, there's two works here. One is very short, more black on black, in which a face just comes into the screen. But the other one is a documentation by Javier Castro. And a lot of the work is very documentary in nature and very research-based in nature. So we see the exhibition as having a bit of a sociological, anthropological bent to it, which I think may not go over so well with a lot of circles within the visual arts world or the curatorial world, because they don't see it as art as such. And I think a lot of the work is borderline as to whether one sees it as art, but they are artists who are doing it, so they see it as art. But this piece, for example, it documents tattoos that people have put on them that are Chinese characters. And they all have an understanding in the yellow text of what those Chinese characters mean. In the white text is what they actually mean, so at times they don't coincide with what they think they're wearing and how they think they're representing themselves. And there's a kind of exoticism within being a part of the larger world by having the text as a Chinese character as opposed to Spanish or English or whatever. So there's this kind of disconnect. And again, this is where like language and your understanding of language becomes destabilized to some degree.
Yeah, and I think also, aside from that, I think in this room we also see in the next piece by Javier that is in this loop, which is black on black. Very briefly you see this mysterious image of a black man coming closer to the light, and then it steps back and disappears. And I think there is something about art in Cuba in the last, especially 10 years, where artists are really taking on the segments of identity. What is it to be in Havana, to be Cuban? It's not about a homogeneous society made of everyone is the same and equal. You see blackness being addressed, you see gender issues being addressed. And we think that there is a continuity with something that was started in the 90s, and it's very clear, for instance, in photography in Cuba in the 90s, but it has been more remarkable in the last few years how some artists are dealing with those issues. And the other thing maybe that this room can tell us about the show and what's happening in Havana with the arts is in the work of, in a piece like this by Javier, The Betrayal of Words, we see video used in a way that is kind of rough, sort of, pointing the camera and showing you something right there without much maybe elaboration or sophistication. Whereas a piece by Alom, an artist who comes from a previous generation, is really more embedded in the idea of film, in a tradition of film, both Cuban and international. And then some other works like Elías photos, Ponjuán drawings, Luis Gómez paintings, Ponjuán paintings. There is more of a formal refinement, and I think you find that in some of the older artists. They're more concerned about the aesthetics and the form and the package of the work. And some of the younger artists tend to be a little bit more for the medium and for a more direct kind of expression that sometimes can be sort of rough.
Yeah, I think it's important to also point out that this exhibition is cross-generational. So there are more mature artists who were working in the 80s and 90s, and younger artists who emerged in the 2000s. So, and there are threads because a number of the more mature artists were teachers of the younger artists. So there's a kind of continuity that's going, but there's also, I think, a difference in forms of expression. And I'm just going to point to this work, and there are a couple of other threads that I didn't bring up. And one is the kind of it's a very abstract idea, but it's of being elsewhere. And also the role of the artist. And the role of the artist pops up in a few works, that the artists are very self-conscious of being artists and where it is they're working. And these images are images of artworks that have been reproduced, I think, from art books.
From art books.
Art books. And then the text on them are all the names of drugs. And drugs, you know, the idea of drugs like taking you elsewhere or taking you into another world that takes you away from the world, the reality that you're in now, as does artwork. You know, and then they're all kind of like a little bit blurry. Actually, they're very beautifully painted, but they're kind of blurry, so it's like going into this kind of other world in a sense. Want to add anything?
Yeah, and also, I mean, this is an artist, we're going to see a couple of his works in the show in other rooms, but I think his work tends to be a little hermetic, like it's a word that is hard to really pinpoint in terms of what the artist is saying, I think, but I think the refinement of the way that the work is done, and especially that gold shining of the paintings, makes you think also about something that is very valuable in a way, something that, and that again ties the piece maybe with the thinking of money in Ponjuán's drawings, but also with Luis Gomez's installation on the other side of this wall that we're going to see later, the carved text on the wall.
And if anybody has any questions, you know, as we're going through this, please feel free to ask. We're going to take this route.
Yeah, we were saying that, you know, this is another of Luis Gomez's work in the show, this installation. I think what's happening with Luis is that he's, as Keith was saying, the paintings where he's matching art historical images with the names of drugs that will make you go on a trip. Talk really about, you know, escaping through art in a way. And I think with this piece, he's proposing this transaction. Would you like to buy my misery? There is definitely someone who should be a buyer here. And we're talking now about the art market and an artist in the context of Cuba trying to sell what he or she produces, but in a very naked manner. There is no artifact, there is no object, there is no painting hanging on the wall. There is actually almost an aggression against the gallery by carving the wall of the gallery directly. And we see again a connection, I think, between the body and a building, in this case the building where we have the whole show. But it's a very direct way of saying, I need the money, you have that power, that money, let's trade, and we will both travel and move and change spaces and go elsewhere with that transaction.
And I think it goes beyond, I mean, Luis Gomez is very conscious of him producing his work as an artist and making a statement as an artist, but I think also as outsiders in a sense. To see a line like that also makes one think of a society that is has less money than we do, and that when you go and visit those places, it's like there is that kind of pressure on, you know, like, do you want to buy my misery? You know, do you want to buy something? And it's like that kind of subliminal message that's there underneath, and it really, I mean, for me, creates a kind of discomfort in looking at it. But there again, it's playing with this idea of economies and values. The piece on the TV here is by Luis Gárciga, and it's a piece he did for the last Havana biennial in 2012. And this is where we're getting into the idea of food and nature, and what this piece is about is a decade ago, the Cuban government was promoting this tree, this plant that they wanted people to plant called morinda, and it was a medicinal plant. And so, you make tea out of it, and it's supposed to be very helpful for you. And people planted them, but after about 10 years, it was like, it was like kind of passé. People got bored with them. They didn't like the taste of the tea or whatever, so nobody really paid attention to them. But these trees are kind of there throughout the city. So Luis decided to do some research on this plant and to see how it was used internationally, and to bring it back to the attention of the Cuban people. And so he had this little Jeep that he drove to different neighborhoods and projected videos about it, and had a little information kiosk, and then also had plants that he gave away to people. And so on this video is people talking about the plant or the tree in their yard and what they think about it, and then him also giving away these plants. And it's really, it seems like artists are very kind of interested in kind of the food ecology that's happening, and Cuba's had a troubled relationship with food over the last 20 years after the special period in the early 90s, after the USSR pulled out their support. The food situation was quite dire and people were living on rations, etc. And the situation is much improved at this point, but as you'll see as we go through the show, that there are other artists kind of dealing with the issue of food and agriculture and health.
And also, I think Louis' piece make us think about something about the transformation of the city, which is the fact that Havana, in a way, has become an urban space where agriculture has sort of is taking over parts of the city by need sometimes, and sometimes just by decay and abandonment of spaces where buildings have fallen, and people just decide to take a plot and grow something. So I think that in a way that the piece makes you think also about the city becoming a kind of more rural environment as opposed to a more urban environment.
And then this a series of photos along the wall here by Juan Carlos Alom also deals very much with the same issue. And Juan Carlos Alom, who did the Havana solo film in the other room, is very interested in sort of marginal, traditional cultures and aspects of Cuban society that again are in this space between being kind of understood and acknowledged by the population and the kind of changes I think that are happening. So these images are of the medicinal forest, and these are photographs of traditional medicinal plants that are in their native environment. So he really sees these not as photographs of landscapes as such, but photographs of curative spaces that have been are not in the Cuban imagination at this point. So he's just trying to keep them alive in some way.
And it's about, I think, in Juan Carlos' work, I think there has always been this tension between looking at people in the city, which is where he mainly lives, and you know, analyzing certain, even in-depth, certain sectors of the city, like religious communities, musicians, and the environment around music. But he also has this other side where he goes into the most remote parts of Cuba, and he has done all these essays, photographic essays and films. And this was part of a set of work that he did in a very remote part of Cuba near Baracoa, in the eastern tip of the island.
And this piece over here by Grethell Rasúa, who is here.
Yeah, here's the show, and that's one of her works up there.
And this is a kind of a document of people who are kind of are identifying their spaces within their homes. And if you see in the book, she's done like an artist book over there, and there's a facsimile to the side of it. But it's people that are kind of decorating the facades of their apartments within a larger building to fix them up, to kind of make them perhaps, quote, more accessible, because a lot of these buildings are in ruin. And I think Grethell told me that some of them don't exist anymore. There's some of these buildings gone, they're gone. So it's just a way of kind of like keeping some dignity alive in terms of how they represent themselves, but it's also kind of like demarcating their space. But they're also painting, they're making aesthetic decisions, so they're also, you know, sort of artists in a sense. You know, it's a documentation. It's quite an extensive documentation that is ongoing. It's been going since 2008. Did you start it? Yeah, 2008, and it's just kind of ongoing thing. And then in the vitrine here, we have a bunch of money exchange vouchers, which was a performance by Luis Gárciga and Miguel Moya. And what they did was they took $1 and went to a money exchange place and exchanged it for Cuban convertible pesos, because there's a double economy there. There's the convertible pesos, which is what me as a tourist would use, and then there are Cuban pesos, which the Cubans would use, and they have a very different value. So they just kept going back and exchanging the money back and forth between the convertible pesos and the Cuban pesos until the Cuban pesos had no more value. And so again, this is this kind of idea of research and kind of like looking at the economy and different ways of how the economy works and what the value of money actually is. within the economy. And it's also like actually makes quite a pretty minimal installation with the colors, which are fading. We did facsimiles, we scanned them because we realized he sent us the actual vouchers and we looked at this like, these aren't going to last through the exhibition. So we thought we'll just leave them in the dark and do these facsimiles of them. So this was a performance that took place in this money exchange place. But again, it's not like, I think like Grethel's work, it's not like overt art as such. So the people that she's documenting don't really know that they're part of an art project, and the people that were in the lineups, didn't really know that they were part of an art project, and the people even giving the money exchanges didn't know. But it's like these guys keep showing up and exchanging the money until they don't have any more.
So are they being videotaped as they were exchanging the money?
No, they didn't. No. This is all documentation.
But it's also, I think this piece, as well as some of the pieces by the Clinic of Buen Contacto, the Clinic of the Good Contact by Celia-Yunior, which we're going to see in the hall. I think these are works where the artists go to a certain established bureaucratic institution, because the money exchange place is an official government-controlled money exchange office, as well as the health system that Celia-Yunior used to create the piece based on is also a government-run system. And so artists go to those systems and they use them to create work based on how that bureaucracy functions. And so and sometimes without the bureaucracy knowing that the artists are working with it, which I think is also very interesting.
It's kind of interesting. It adds a level of the fact that they fade to zero. In a way, kind of, makes a lot of sense, right? Together with the Cuban peso too. So there's something to, not that you shouldn't have done the facsimiles, but I think it's really telling that
And this video here is work by Celia-Yunior, between two artists. And again, it's one of these more sort of ambient works, in that it's just like a video of a car driving down a road. But what they're photographing are what were former farms. And what's happened is there's a plant called marabu that has been is not native to Cuba, and it has been introduced into Cuba, and it is taking over all that land, and it's very invasive and it's very difficult to eradicate. So it's really making that land kind of unproductive. And there's a text that streams over top, which is from a 17th century poem about the fruits of Cuba and how abundant the food and how wonderful the food in Cuba is compared to what you find in Europe. So this is a kind of an example of where there's nothing overtly political in the work, but me as a viewer kind of sort of thinks, okay, well, it's like the Cuban agricultural policies maybe aren't really working properly because only 7% of the land is like being used for agriculture, whereas there could be much more land used for agriculture and growing food or growing export crops or whatever. But so again, it's like there's nothing sort of being said, but there's something there, and I think again it's for the viewer to kind of fill in those blanks. You want to talk about this piece?
Yeah, and so over here we have a piece by Celia-Yunior, which is definitely a research-based kind of work, and it's also one of those pieces in the show about language. In this case, academic, scholarly language. What they have done is that they have collected the titles of theses and doctoral theses at the University of Havana at different faculties, history, philosophy, sociology. And so we are just seeing this monotonous projection of those titles, which are really very suggestive, and they show you a richness in terms of the interest of the people doing the research, the students and the professors, all kinds of topics, even linking Cuban culture and Cuban issues with international global issues. But at the same time, what happens is that knowledge is staying within the realm of the academy, and it's not going anywhere outside of the borders of the university. So this is not having an impact in society. So maybe some of the solutions to Cuban problems are in this research, have already been found, but no one is really paying attention to that. And therefore they give this appearance of something that, is of no importance, something that has been kind of left to root on the floor to this thesis that have been done and this intellectual curiosity that is not being really used for anything purposeful.
And also, I mean, one of the challenges with the exhibition was the issue of translation and translation of works. And like we didn't like translate all of these because there's like hundreds of them. But I think like there's enough sort of words that are approximate English words that people can kind of like figure out some of the thematics, which have to do with things like tourism, the discourse between capitalism and socialism. There's things in there about sexual abuse, things about agriculture and farming. So, but again, as Tonel said, like these things don't really go out into or dispersed into the public realm. And we have done didactics on labels, and I'm not a big fan of doing didactics, but what we did was we tried to just provide the context for the work, not explaining what it is, but it's like, this is what's happening. No, we're not trying to interpret it as such, but just so that people can like pick up on certain things that might be untranslatable within the artwork itself. And it was something that a lot of artists asked us about when we were there. It's like, well, how is this going to translate into your particular context in Canada? So that's one of the issues that we had to think about. It was a challenge, actually. But we can go to the next one.
Work been shown in Cuba?
Mm-hmm.
What's the status of the different artists in Cuba? I imagine it varies, but has some of the work been shown in Cuba?
Yes, a lot of this work has been shown in Cuba, yeah. But you know, again, there's this issue. I think that, like, artists in Cuba know the limits of what can be represented or what can be said, but they play with them. And I mean, I think an example is this painting down here, which is the translates as "give your blood." The mother country needs it, and that can be interpreted like a couple of ways. It's like, you know, it could be like, you know, we feel this responsibility to give blood to the Red Cross. We're doing something good for the country and as a citizen, or it can be like, give your blood in whatever you have to suffer through with everything that's going on. So, but it's again, it's not overt. And so you, as the viewer, have to kind of like play with that as well. But so, I mean, a piece like this, you know, it can be shown because you can't prove that, you know, once you own it conceptually, nobody can take it away from you. So, and we have these other pieces, these other three paintings here that deal with language. Do you want to talk about those, Tonel?
Yeah, well, I think that going back to Ponjuán's work, I mean, we can see in his painting here, the paintings in the other room, or the one in the hall to the plaza or to the square, a la plaza, the interest in language, but also I think especially with this one and the one on the hall, the fact that he's working from a decision that were already made in terms of using those texts for propaganda. The text is coming from posters, from billboards, from the 60s and 70s, and he's sort of taking the propaganda and turning that into a beautiful painting to be hanging in a gallery or living room even. This artist, Jorge Wellesley, who is a younger guy, made this painting, Acclimatism, Exit, and Abajo. He also worked with language in a tradition that you can tie as well to poster design and graphic design in Cuba from the 60s and 70s. Artists like Felix Beltran, for instance. But I think in the case of Wellesley, like with other younger artists, they're even more interested in the fact that language can really blur and can really say without saying much, or can be polysemic. And the idea with abajo, I think, is very poignant in the sense that abajo could be down, as in, you know, at the bottom of the painting, or it could also be down with, which is more political, because in the tradition of Cuba, politically, there had been this idea of down with, abajo, and then the name of whichever regime or president was in power. So when you look at the painting, especially in a Cuban context, the painting is very loaded politically, but at the same time it is not, because it's just about placement of the word and, you know, what is top, what is below, what is on the side. And on the other hand, the paintings are really very well done again. I mean, in a case like this, you know, in many of these artists, it's not just about what they're doing, but the skills and the way that they're packaging the work and the image.
And the videos at the end, it's a series of videos by Lázaro Saavedra, and you can just kind of watch what's going on in this one actually. And they were probably the most kind of political, and you can kind of see what's happening with this one is that he's got this doll, he's pulling out the eyes, he's going to cut open the mouth, he's going to stuff this propaganda into its mouth with tweezers. It's quite painful even though it's just this little stuffed doll. And then he opens the head and pulls out the brain, which is cotton battened, so it's kind of this fluff. And then they end up turning into these clouds against the blue background. So, but again, it's like, as it's not real representation of something, it's like, I think there's a kind of maybe a little like leeway in terms of interpretation, and a lot of his other pieces, there's animation that he uses. There's also two pieces where it's going back to that reference of the artist, where he has images of himself talking to himself, and it's talking to himself about being an artist and like, why am I an artist? Like, what's the point? Or, you know, has MoMA collected your work? Have you been invited to the Venice Biennale? No, it's like, okay, I don't want to talk to you. So it's that, you know, that struggles of the artist within like the society and culture as a whole. And then over here we've got these three videos, these are more, they're by Javier Castro and Luis Gárciga, and they're more along the lines of documentary work. In particular, Javier Castro. The one on the left is a fairly long video about two people having an argument about Jesus and whether Jesus existed, which is, you kind of think of an unusual point of discussion in a communist country. And then the other ones are they're just little vignettes of people. One is a mother talking to her two daughters about how to protect themselves if they are accosted on the street by a man. One with mothers talking about their sons who have been wounded, and there's a kind of pride because it's related to what's the first name?
Antonio Maceo.
Antonio Maceo, who was a part of the War of Independence in the late 19th century, who was killed, and he had these 26 wounds. And so there's this idea that he was heroic and sacrificed himself. So there's this odd kind of relationship about what all of that means within their culture. He also lives in one of the poorer sections of town, so it's kind of a representation of his immediate neighborhood and the people that he lives with. And then there's another video of kids talking about what they want to be when they grow up. And this is kind of referring to kind of the future, and it's everything from being like an airline stewardess to being an economist to being a foreigner to being a dictator. So it's like all these, but it's this hopeful thing at the same time. And then Luis Gárciga's, there are different kinds of vignettes. This one here is of him being in the bathtub in his own jacuzzi, when he makes the jacuzzi by blowing through a hose and creating the bubbles. And there's it kind of refers to a sort of resourcefulness that also happens in Cuba, is that you make do with what you have. And it's also a reason why a lot of these works are kind of low-tech, because they don't have really expensive equipment and the money to do high production. So they're very like really direct, really on the ground, and just there. Here's one about, again, kind of like going into money, pickpocketing somebody on the bus, putting it in his pocket. The other guy goes around behind him and pickpockets his wallet back. They're very short, they're very, you know, they're... And he's got another one of his family and friends of his family who go around their homes talking about, where they would put the living room if they could put a living room in. And they're out in the backyard, and it's going to go, well, the bedroom would go over there, we'd have the bathroom there, or I would put new tiles here, or there's a hole in the ceiling, and that's where the bedroom is going to go. So it's like always kind of like projecting into the future, and there's kind of like this, there is a sense of hope within what seems to be this difficult world to live in. But I would also say that, for me, that part of this stuff isn't kind of isolating Cuba or Havana from our own worlds that we live in. I sort of feel that maybe it reflects back upon us because we have our own bureaucracies, we have our own governments, we have our own systems that we have to deal with, and I don't think all of us are totally happy with everything that's going on. So it's like everybody's kind of waiting for that change, for that world that we all hope is out there somewhere.
Going back to the black and white photographs, you said the other night that those were film, so they're rather than digital.
No, the photos.
On this, yeah, the
No, they are
plants.
photos, but he did a film while he was doing those photos. He also did a film
Yeah,
in that region.
and going back to art and the films of the photographs of the sugar mills are also film. They're
Those
not.
are two different artists, though.
Yeah, but are they both
Oh, yeah,
using?
they're done
Are
in
they
film.
both
Oh,
using
yeah.
film?
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
curious. Are there some that are digital here, or is film? Would you say is that reflecting an older time period, or is that what's currently
Juan
being
Carlos
used?
is the only actual film. It's a 16 millimeter film that was transferred to video, but I think all the others are videos.
Yeah, but she's talking about the black and white
Oh, I
photos,
see.
which are done with film, like 35 millimeter.
So
or
I'm curious that that's being used. Is that an aesthetic choice, do you suppose, or is it because that's
I
part
think
of?
it's aesthetic.
Okay.
They're more traditional photographers and come out of a more
Yeah.
traditional photography
Okay.
practice. Yeah.
Yeah, both of them and many other photographers would have access to digital cameras, and they would do work like that. But I think in the case of Elias and Alom, they really have chosen to do photo with film, still using film, developing in a traditional way, even though sometimes the final print might be digital. So they can take the negative, maybe they will work the negative through the digital, software and then print. But it starts with a film image, at least for now and for most of their work.
Pleasure to see the density of the film, the photographs.
And here we've got more works by Ponjuán, which relate to the drawings of the money, and these are drawings of gold bars, and a gold again representing that idea of value and desire in a sense, I think, as well. Do you want to add?
Yeah, and also we thought that it would be interesting to look at the work of an artist who is both depicting Cuban pesos, the stacks of bills as we saw in the first room, which is a really devalued currency, and gold, these gold bars, and they have, with the same treatment, they look like beautiful, detailed, still life, and that makes you think that there is a connection, that they are related, but we know that in most of the world these days, currencies and gold are not related anymore, really, but much less in Cuba. And so you think that the artist is telling us about an economy, a situation where the national currency could be again tied to a precious metal, like used to be in many other places around the world, and it's still supposed to be, even though it doesn't work like that. But we still think about, and economy think about, who has the biggest gold reserve in the world? Is it China? Is it Germany? Is it the US, etc.? So I think the reflection of Ponjuán is telling us a little bit about the beginning of a market economy in Cuba at some point.
Do they have some historical reflections as well, those ones? Because the captions in there are,
No, that's very interesting too. The other thing that's happening with Ponjuán drawings in general is that he's using, the paper is actually not just drawing paper. This used to be like big old art history books again, where you have the plates glued to this card page, and then the print it's just telling you what used to be the original image there, are historical images often. So, you know, a certain architectural building, a certain painting. Actually, the titles or the brief descriptions can be very suggestive, you know, take you back to ancient Egyptian art or European painting before the 19th century. But then what you see, there is then a contradiction or a new connection between the image of the goal and the build and the description on the text. They can be totally diverging, or they can create a new relation that could make you think of. So is this telling us that maybe the money, the Cuban money, is as valuable as this ancient Egypt artifact? Or is this devaluating the value of that ancient artifact? It could be both, right?
And this video here, which is also by Grethell. You know, she said this is the most intriguing of the whole lot, and I think it's one of the ones that's probably most difficult to look at as well. And we see it as another kind of ambient piece that's sort of like there, and it's there kind of over your shoulder even when you're looking this way, because once you see it, you kind of like, you want to look at it, but you don't want to look at it. And I don't think it needs a lot of interpretation. I think it's really just, it is what it is, and I think that it brings up a lot of kind of thoughts about struggles and what you're dealing with, and how far you push into it, and what you're pushing against.
And also, I think for her work, I think when you look at the three pieces you have in the show, I think the video about the buildings, but people related to the buildings, the video we're going to see in the whole about the garden and the plants and the spices, and this piece, there are a lot about the body, right, and how the body interacts with the world.
Yeah.
So I think Grethell has this tendency to tell us about the grotesque body in a way more than anything else. Stuff going in and out of the body touching, expanding, extending.
But also confronting those things and ultimately finding a beauty in it. And that'll be evident in one of the other pieces, which is also kind of hard to watch.
Is that a cactus?
Yes, it's a cactus. And it goes on for 25 minutes.
I think the way you placed it right next to "Would you like to buy my misery" is perfect.
Well, this is a part of the thing. I mean, this is a part of these kind of like dialogues that go on, because the piece at the end is like, "Give your blood."
Yeah.
And there actually blood starts to emerge on her tongue, and it's like, so it's like these sort of things, and then. Now, do you want to talk about the Sandra Ceballos?
Yeah, this is the work by Sandra Ceballos, which is both a sculpture but also a byproduct of a performance. When we look at there's this artist book, which is really, based on a notebook, the one that kids use in Cuba for school, the normal scholar notebook. And so the music stand, which is an old music stand, nicely carved in wood. So the piece is really started by Sandra using a book, which contains a speech by Fidel Castro in 1975 to the first Congress of Cuba's Communist Party, and it was like his report to the party at the time. So this speech, which was probably typewritten, and then Castro read the speech, and then it was published in a book. And so then Sandra comes and starts to tear up the pages from the book, make little balls, little things, and she filled the whole object with those, pieces of paper. But at the same time, before she does that with the pages, she transcribes chapters of the book, handwritten, into this notebook, and he documents the process of what she has done in the artist book. So this is actually the cover of the original book. And so at the end, we're seeing an appropriation by the artist of this very ideological speech, a destruction of that speech, but then also a rescue of that in a sort of infantilized, childish way, right? And so it's titled Diffuse Symphony for Batman. Batman being one of many words, many names to refer to Fidel Castro in on the streets in Cuba. But also, I think at the end the speech becomes music, because when we see that those words sitting where we would have the music in the music stand, then it's not more ideology. It's more like sound, just pure sound, like sound bites, background sound, soundtrack of, what's going on in Cuba in general.
And again, I think it also works with language in that she's torn out these pages of something that's quite rhetorical and crunched them up and stuffed them in so that meaning is lost, but at the same time using this children's book, it's like a kind of punishment as well, that you have to when you have to write after school the sentences over again so that it actually becomes ingrained. So there's those kind of sort of contradictions that go on. Okay, let's go down to the hallway. The little television sets are 2 videos by Jesús Hdez, and they're like TV shows. They're like TV newscasts. The one on the right is sort of like extolling the new bus system, the new 5 peso bus system, and talking about the health care system. And the other one on the left is talking about the intellects and cultural producers relative to the Ministry of Culture and the kind of the conflicts between them. But actually they look like real newscasts, but he's constructed them, and so that they're fake, and he's used actors in them. He's also drawn from newscast footage, so you don't really know what's real and what's not real. And as somebody who doesn't know, I mean, I could sit down and watch these and think that this was the truth. And so it really kind of reveals like what here is a kind of propaganda, but really what any government, corporation, advertising agency is doing when they're promoting whatever it is they're promoting. Are they promoting the truth or not? And they put it in a format that makes it really convincing that it is the truth. So he's really working against that kind of mentality. And this piece down here is another one of Grethel's works, and there is like a kind of a growing entrepreneurship in Cuba. I mean, everything was more or less privatized at one point, but they've loosened it up so people can get licenses, etc. Well, Grethell has a small entrepreneurial project here, but she doesn't have a license for it. But what it is she has her menu of different herbs that you can buy from her, but they're created by collecting the excrement of the people that are selecting the herb that they want to grow. So she collects their excrement, mixes it with soil, plants her seeds, grows her plants, harvests them, dries them, puts them in the herb bottles, and sells them back to the person that ordered them. And this is again this idea of the body that Tonel was talking about, and the things that we kind of think are like not sure about, but that actually she's using in a very productive way and an entrepreneurial way. And I say some of it's quite difficult to look at, but it's another kind of research project. And she's talked about how she actually learned a lot about plants and things like that by doing this project. Do you have anything you want to?
No, I would mention that since Grethell is here, if you have maybe a comment or a question now or later for her, I think she would be happy to chat with you about it.
And this is a piece that Tonel was talking about earlier. It's called the Good Contact Clinic. And Celia-Yunior got with some of their artist friends, and when you want to make an appointment with a doctor, you usually go to a bureaucracy or a ministry office or something, and they set up appointments for you, but you really don't know who you're getting. So the artists went around and they created these relationships with doctors and specialists that they